The Halion Chronicles. The protectorate of Hellas stands at the edge of war. Titans stir, and ancient machines whisper in the void. Beneath the crimson grays of Thanatos, fate is cast in steel and circuitry. The Olympians walk among the mortals, spinning their schemes. Myth do not endure, they break, they burn, they fall. Only those bold enough to defy fate may earn their place among legend. Your cyber saga journey continues now. Shards. Then, with a blink, the vision was gone. It evaporated like dust in a shaft of light, and yet something lingered. A shimmer in the corner of his eyes. A residue of impossible angles etched behind his lids. The afterhum of strange geometry pulsed gently in his skull, each pulse like the throb of a forgotten chord. Symbols that had no names traced themselves across the backs of his thoughts, dissolving before he could hold on to their shapes. Alongside them came unknown tastes, smells, and strange words, half heard, half felt, simmering at the edges of perception. They flickered and echoed, not in the air, but inside him, like memories that had never been his. And if the vision had left behind more than just impressions, a residue of unclaimed identity. He stood once more in the dimly lit hall. The cleric, seemingly unaware of the divine encounter, continued through the next door without a glance. Thrish followed, his gait uncertain, as if each step pulled him further from the vision, and yet not entirely free of its grasp. Down a narrow, winding hallway they moved. Through the slits in the stone walls, Thrish caught fleeting glimpses of the abyss beyond, the yawning black below the balcony. The wind sliced through the gaps, sharp and keening, tugging at his thoughts like unseen fingers. As they descended the cold staircase, the wind intensified, no longer playful, but insistent. It coiled through the inner square of the temple like a living thing, curling around braziers and sending tiny whirlwinds scudding across the cobblestones. The flames sputtered and stretched sideways, shadows flickering like ragged banners in a mounting gale. The air hummed with tension, as if the rift itself were drawing breath. A massive gate loomed at both ends of the square, but the cleric led him instead through a smaller, unassuming side door. And there, as they stepped onto the balcony, the wind struck full force. It hit like a wave of knives. It screamed over the balcony and its extended archways, tearing through the columns, part chiseled stone, part scavenged scrap from tools forgotten underworld. The structure groaned under the force, metal creaking in protest. Thrish staggered, his cloak flailing like a torn sail. The rift of the dead sprawled beneath him in a churning haze of mist and dust, writhing like a wounded beast. The wind rose higher, It howled through the serpent-coiled pillars, shrieked between the gaps, built itself into a wailing crescendo. It lashed at its face, bit into his ears, crawled beneath his garments. The balcony swayed, barely, but enough to make Thrish's gut twist. He gripped the nearest support, knuckles white, his whiskers trembling as the rift exhaled its storm. Then it came, the full fury of the shardstorm. It roared up from the depth, a cyclone of debris and noise, of glittering obsidian silvers and biting gusts that twisted around the temple spires. Shards hissed through the air like a swarm of razors. The abyss had awakened, and its voice was wind. The storm kissed the balcony with murderous affection, screaming past him in a blur of blood-tinted light and bone-chilling sound. The Titan's breath returned, ancient and unrelenting. Thrish could do nothing but brace himself and endure. The rift had found its tongue, and it sang in shards. Thrish pressed himself into the shallow windbreak beside the archway, the stone biting cold through his cloak. The shardstorm had abated, but the wind still wailed like some wounded revenant, gathering his breath and what remained of his bravado. He crept forward, the fur along his spine bristling with each gust. He stepped to the edge. The rift yawned below like a hungry god, bottomless and breathing. Thrish imagined the fall, first the plunge, then the flurry of jagged edges, then the dark silence. His stomach flipped, a shudder crawled up his back. He reeled, staggering from the edge with a sharp inhale, his breath breaking into short, clipped gasps.
"Wait here,"
the cleric said, her voice oddly distant now, echoing through the stone like a departing spell.
"The High Priest will summon you shortly."
Then she was gone, swallowed by the corridor. Thrish remained. Bython's tongue jutted into the air, narrow and exposed. It defied gravity, suspended over the vast rift like a curse held in place by forgotten rituals. Wind shrieked around him, dragging phantom voices up from the depths. Beneath his feet, the stone felt less like earth and more like a held breath. He stood, cloak flapping, alone upon the threshold of worlds. The dark red glow of Thanatos swelled in the western sky, rising like a prophet of calamity. It was the seventh cycle, and still the night clung to the world. Long, sinister shadows spilled across the rift, painting the broken landscape in tones of rust and bruise. Thanatos drew farther from the rim of Gaia, its molten surface writhing like a cauterized wound. Above, the stars were nearly lost behind the high boiling storm clouds. Only the occasional pinprick of light pierced the gloom, vanishing as quickly as it appeared. Helios had not yet risen on Tool's side of the world, though a faint pressure of morning loomed in the east, a sickly wine-red pallor edging the horizon. It was not dawn, it was a warning. A sudden, distant howl from below snapped Trish's attention back to the rift. The storm had taken a momentary breath, just enough to clear the view, and the murky red light, filtered through dust and drifting cloud, he could just make out movement far below. Flickering orange light pulsed through the chasm like the last embers of some infernal forge. Shadows collide in slow, jerky violence. Squinting, Thrish identified the hunched warp silhouettes of Plutons, mutants shaped by eons of suban exposure, locked in a snarling, clawing melee. A few of them scrabbled up steep rock faces, their limbs trembling, teeth flashing, only to lose purchase and slide back into the rift's jagged belly. Their snarls were broken, swept away by the wind, but their desperation was unmistakable. Thrish watched entranced and repelled as the grotesque drama played out in silence. Then, on the far side of the chasm, torches flared to life. The light caught on helms and spears as soldiers took formation. Araron's hoplites, or perhaps Tool's temple guards. Voices barked orders, thin and brittle over the roaring gusts. Trish's thoughts turned to Archon Araron, his former commander, the bulwark of the Shard, and hegemon of Mythorania. The beggar's warning echoed again in his mind. Araron would not ignore the threat. The Plutons could not be allowed to rise. Even this far from the savannas of Mythorania, the Archon's reach extended, his influence a blade drawn in defense of the rift. If Tool was to endure, the line must hold. Figures fitted along the rim like specters, torches bobbing through the storm-blown dark. Rocks arced down towards the frenzied Plutons, some struck with brutal finality. Others vanished without sound into the chasm's maw. Thrish narrowed his eyes, the wind tugging at his cloak once more. The brief reprieve in the storm was ending. The rift was drawing breath again. More figures moved across the edge, blurry silhouettes against the blood-tinged haze, the torches flickering wildly as gusts surged around them. Below, rocks continued to fall, crashing into the chaos. The sound was devoured by the abyss, but Thrish could still make out the shudder of impact, the sudden collapse of limbs. The creatures were being driven back into the dark that had birthed them. Thrish stood silent, staring out over the rift. With Thanatos rising at the horizon, opposite Tool, he clutched the scroll tightly in his hand, awaiting the High Priest's summons and the mysteries it would unveil. The howling wind, the flickering torchlight, the distant battle cries, all braided together in a cacophony that tangled within his oozing, fractalized mind. Then a gust rose, more violent than the others. It tore through the rift, screaming upward in a spiral of glittering debris. The storm bared its teeth, and in a blink, a silver of obsidian caught Thrish across the cheek. He gasped. Time stretched in the instant of pain. The shard's edge so clean, so sharp, it felt like a whisper before the burn. Blood welled slowly, red as the sky, and began to thread its way down through the matted fur on his jaw. It shimmered in the dim light, a thin line of heat against the cold bite of the wind. Thrish staggered, the sting grounding him in brutal clarity. He jerked up his cloak, the bullhorn leather cracking in the gale, shielding his face as more projectiles hissed through the air. He retreated from the balcony's edge, chest heaving, and pressed himself against the temple wall, seeking shelter behind the weathered statue of a child. The storm shrieked around him. Shards screamed past, detonating into splinters against stone and floor. Grit peppered his fur like angry sand, his cloak flailing wildly in the chaos. A crack split the night as another shard struck the statue, shearing one of the stone fingers clean off. Thrish crouched low, tail tight to his body, cloak wrapped around him like a cocoon. Behind him the rift roared, a beast not yet done with its hunger. The last howls of the storm spun upwards, fading into a silence that throbbed like an aftershock. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the storm relented, but only slightly. The howling diminished to a restless murmur, not silence but a tense pause, like a predator watching from the dark. The wind still crept and curled around the balcony, no longer shrieking but whispering of its return. Thrish lowered his cloak a fraction, ears flicking in the still tense air, braced for the next strike. None came. Instead, the murmurs of chanting rose faintly from somewhere within the temple, layered with the soft echo of footsteps. Playful, almost too light for this place. Beyond the flickering torchlight, barely sheltered behind the pillars of the palisade, a youthful figure emerged from the mist Thanatos cast in its wake. The boy moved with eerie calm, cloaked in a dark hood. His eyes were sharp, glacial blue. His pale skin seemed to absorb the torchlight, streaks of silver-white hair slipping free as he advanced with the quiet ease of someone walking towards an old friend. His youthful face came into focus, lips curling into a mischievous, knowing smile. At a glance, he looked human, perhaps 15 processions old. But Thrish knew better the moment their eyes met. "Anroim?" he muttered, disbelieving, his gaze twitching as though trying to shake free of a mirage. What in the name of the rift would Anroim be doing here in Tool? He had known the boy from the Yellowstone. Anroim's features had always bordered on the unreal, porcelain smooth, unmarred by time or weather, unsettling in their flawlessness. No creases of age, no trace of fatigue. His skin looked carved from Titanstone, cool and immutable. He wore the simple robe of the Bython tool, marked subtly with a serpentine insignia that glinted when the torchlight caught it just so. And his eyes, gods, those eyes, still shimmered with that boundless, ageless energy. He hadn't changed. Not in the slightest. Not since the day he had left Lurkwa and the Yellowstone.
"Hello, Thrish,"
Anroim said, with a smile both warm and knowing.
"Do you remember me?"
Thank you for listening to the Halion Chronicles. You journeyed until the end and likely enjoyed your travels through this episode. Let us know with a like and share it with fellow travelers of Halion. Never miss an episode, subscribe and turn on the notification to stay ahead of the unfolding saga. For free additional content, lore deep dives and more stories from Halion, visit our Substack at halionchronicles.substack.com.